If Taylor Swift ruled ancient Egypt, the first thing she'd do, right after renaming the Nile to the Eras Tour River, sponsored by Papyrus, is have every single ex-boyfriend mummified and buried in separate pyramids, each one playing a different heartbreak ballad on repeat for eternity. Somewhere between the eyeliner and the eyeliner, she would have risen not as Pharaoh but as the Pharaoh, a divine pop force with a death glare sharper than a ceremonial khopesh and lyrics that made scribes weep in hieroglyphs. This is not your average history lesson. This is what would have happened if the queen of petty anthems and stadium domination time traveled back to 1290 BCE and took over the most powerful empire in the ancient world. We're not talking Cleopatra light here. We're talking Swiftopatra the unbothered, the bejeweled, the chart-topping destroyer of dynasties. In this kingdom, cats aren't just sacred, they're Swift's emotional support animals. Temples double as sold-out venues. Heartbreak is punishable by conscription to quarry duty. And if you even think about starting a rebellion, she'll drop a disk scroll so devastating that your entire bloodline gets edited out of history by royal decree. As for her council, made up entirely of reincarnated Swifties who shout, "Mother," in unison every time she enters the throne room. It's absurd. It's dramatic. And terrifyingly, it's not that far off from how ancient Egypt really worked. So close your eyes. Picture a sandstorm made of glitter. Hear the chorus of 10,000 slaves carving the words, "We are never ever getting back together," into the side of a limestone obelisk. This isn't fantasy. This is historical fiction. If that fiction was dunked in sarcasm, embalmed in eyeliner, and wrapped in 24-karat revenge. Welcome to ancient Egypt, ruled by Taylor Swift. Let's begin. If Taylor Swift had ruled ancient Egypt, it would have been the first recorded case of a civilization voluntarily turning into a cult with a fan base. Not a government. Not a kingdom. A personality cult built around eyeliner, passive-aggressive poetry, and the sacred art of the perfectly timed comeback. Forget the pyramids, they'd just be oversized lyric books built in limestone. Forget the gods too. Ra, Osiris, Anubis, they'd all be replaced by a pantheon of X's, each assigned a constellational seat in the sky depending on how badly they screwed up. Welcome to the Swiftian dynasty. Prepare your offerings of gold vinyl and emotional vulnerability because in this world even the Pharaoh cries in lowercase cursive. Her rise to power would not be from bloodline or conquest, but sheer charisma. The court scribes wouldn't just announce her coronation, they'd write entire dramatic scrolls about her origin story, most of which she'd edit herself. She'd decree that all portraits of her be side-lit with a torch and every fresco include just the right amount of cheekbone shadow. She wouldn't need to overthrow anyone. The current pharaoh would have simply stepped down after seeing her confidence and whispered, "Yeah, fair enough." Power would kneel. Day one of her reign, she abolishes taxes for anyone who owns a harp. If you can't sing in falsetto about betrayal, you're paying double. The palace guards are replaced with an all-female legion trained in both spear combat and interpretive dance. They don't walk. They stomp in synchronized fashion, hair flowing like slow-motion revenge. Her throne? Not gold. That's cliché. It's made of the bones of her enemies, real or perceived, carefully gilded and arranged in a heart shape, obviously. Every meeting in the royal court starts with her saying, "So, I've been thinking about how men ruin everything," and everyone nods solemnly as the high priestess passes around scented oils infused with spite. No one dares challenge her authority. Not because she's particularly violent, although disappearances do seem to spike after her bad days, but because she's devastating with words. Insults from Taylor aren't screamed. They're sung in gentle upper register tones with so much pain you start apologizing for things you haven't even done yet. Once, a minor official called her overrated in the marketplace. The next morning he found his name struck from every public record, his home flooded with cat urine, and a mysterious ballad titled "The One with the Weasel Face" echoing from every boat that passed his village. He drowned himself in the Nile later that week. The nation simply moved on. Let's talk governance. Taylor wouldn't rule by decree, she'd rule by mood. If she woke up in her 1989 era, the nation would enjoy beachside festivals and generous grain rations. But if she woke in reputation mode, best believe the chariots are coming for someone's head. The official calendar would be replaced by eras, each one defined by her wardrobe. Entire years might be declared black velvet season. The peasants would be forced to wear matching tones or be exiled to the desert to reflect on their failure to accessorize. Foreign diplomacy? An absolute blood sport. Other kingdoms would send tributes, fine linens, perfume, lapis lazuli. Taylor would send back personalized scrolls containing cryptic metaphors about betrayal, causing at least 3 border skirmishes out of sheer confusion. Once, an ambassador from Nubia made the mistake of gifting her a lion cub without realizing she was in her folklore period. She had him executed by Harp string strangulation and sent his army a handwritten note that just said, "You should have known." They didn't retaliate. They just went home and cried. As for religion, that gets complicated. She wouldn't abolish the gods, she'd rebrand them. Batet would become the first cat. Horus, god of kingship in the sky, recast as her opening act. Temples would be converted into fan sanctuaries. Pilgrims would come from distant lands not to pray, but to recite stanzas of her sacred lyrics in dramatic tones while wearing linen robes stitched with snake embroidery. Every equinox, the faithful would gather at the banks of the Nile and scream-cry the lyrics of All Too Well, papyrus version, into the wind while releasing doves shaped like middle fingers. And the men. Well, the men. Ancient Egypt wasn't exactly known for its emotional sensitivity, but under Taylor's rule, masculinity would undergo a forced transformation. Warriors would be required to complete emotional aptitude assessments before wielding a sword. Gladiators would have to write poems about their childhood trauma before being allowed in the arena. Boys raised under her dynasty wouldn't just be taught to read and write, they'd be taught how to say, "I see how I hurt you and I'm working on myself." Of course, saying that incorrectly would still result in public shaming and possibly a slow death by eyeliner poisoning, but at least progress is being made. The economy would shift entirely to merchandise. Silk production would quadruple due to demand for embroidered cloaks featuring passive-aggressive quotes. The black market would boom with bootleg tapestries depicting her latest breakup imagery. Scribes would spend years drafting poetic diss tracks for future use, most of which get rejected for not having enough bite. One anonymous poet who dared use the phrase "forgiveness is freedom" was flayed alive and his skin turned into a scroll titled "Men Are Still Trash." Let's not romanticize this reign as some feminist utopia either. It's a dictatorship. A sparkly, extremely well-branded dictatorship. The people are not free. They are emotionally manipulated into thinking they are, because she tells them, gently, that their suffering makes them strong. And because every street corner has a marble bust of her smiling like she knows every single secret you've ever buried. Which she does. Because the Ministry of Emotional Surveillance is real. They read your diary. They quoted back to you during audits. You thought the Eye of Horus was a religious symbol? It's just her eyeliner stencil. Even nature obeys her. The Nile floods only when she permits it. Crops bloom in her name. A single disapproving glance from her can cause drought. And when the harvest is good, she thanks herself and releases a new version of an old poem, except this one is whispered in reverse and only readable during eclipses. The people cheer anyway. What else can they do? You don't question her. You simply survive her. Because in a world where Taylor Swift rules ancient Egypt, no one has power. They only have a chance at not being turned into content. And that's the real fear. Not dying, not exile, but becoming the nameless inspiration behind another verse that gets chanted in temples for the next 1,000 years by teenagers in crocodile skin sandals who think you're just some myth. So sit back. Accept the eyeliner. Keep your emotions in check. And for the love of all that's holy, never, ever tell her to calm down. She will remember. She will retaliate. And worst of all, she will write. Before we talk about how Taylor Swift would handle crime in ancient Egypt, you need to understand something very basic about her justice system. There isn't one. There's only karma. But not the sweet, poetic kind that gently balances the universe over time. No, this is karma weaponized, institutionalized, codified into law and carved into temple walls. Justice under her rule isn't blind, it's a glowing-eyed deity in thigh-high sandals, armed with a poison scroll and a court of emotionally unstable backup dancers trained in dramatic exits. There are no trials in Swift's Egypt. Not really. You don't get a chance to explain yourself. You get a seating assignment in the Temple of Public Reckoning, and if your name ends up on her playlist of grievances, you're finished. Picture this. A vast hall lined with golden statues of Taylor's many expressions. Judging, sighing, pretending not to care but absolutely caring. Your accuser walks in, reads their charges in rhymed couplets, and then the crowd votes by throwing pomegranate seeds at your face. If you're covered in red fruit by the end of the reading, you're guilty. If not, well, you still probably did something. The seeds just missed. What counts as a crime, you ask? Oh darling, practically everything. Singing off-key within the palace walls is an offense. Wearing yesterday's eyeliner in public? Punishable by shame procession. And God's help you if you're caught plagiarizing lyrics. One poor scholar was found scribbling lines that bore a suspicious resemblance to enchanted, and he was immediately stripped of rank, dignity, and eyebrows, then forced to walk naked through the court of mirrors while the crowd chanted, "Say it in your own words." He never wrote again. But not all punishments are that simple. Some are theatrical. Swiftian justice isn't about correction, it's about the performance of accountability. When a nobleman's wife was accused of being emotionally manipulative, a capital crime in this regime, she wasn't beheaded or banished. She was sentenced to live in the Gallery of Regret, a sprawling underground museum filled with giant stone tablets bearing every verse of Taylor's most heart-wrenching ballads, sung by an eternal chorus of disembodied voices. Food is delivered through a slit in the wall. She sleeps on a bed of shredded love letters. Her only companion is a cat named Guilt. Of course, some punishments are less metaphorical. For petty crimes like lying about your feelings or ghosting someone after a 3-day courtship, there's a very literal punishment: stoning. But the stones aren't rocks. They're small, carved hearts made of alabaster, each one inscribed with a lyric about betrayal. Victims are pelted while the choir of priestesses recites verses from Dear John. The sentence ends when the accused breaks down crying or publicly admits their emotional immaturity, whichever comes first. Now one might ask, what about the laws? Surely they're written somewhere? Well, they are. But they're not in stone tablets or papyrus scrolls. They're in albums. Every citizen is required to memorize the full discography by age 12. The lyrics double as legal code. Teachers assign court cases in the form of songwriting prompts. Judges, if you can even call them that, carry lutes instead of gavels and make rulings in falsetto. Even appeals must be submitted as well-structured metaphors. A man once tried to defend his innocence by performing a spoken-word allegory comparing heartbreak to a drought. He was laughed out of the court and sentenced to 4 years of forced emotional transparency in the salt mines of self-reflection. Don't be fooled into thinking this system favors women, though. It doesn't favor anyone. The only protected class is the emotionally articulate. If you can't express your inner turmoil with poetic precision, you are nothing in this world. Farmers cry while they harvest. Blacksmiths hum breakup songs as they hammer. Children are taught not to suppress emotions but to weaponize them. Crying is considered a sign of spiritual power. Silence is suspicious. Stoicism is grounds for interrogation. There is no hiding from vulnerability in Swift's Egypt. It is mandatory. You don't bury your feelings. You monologue them into the wind until the gods themselves get uncomfortable. Even the military has changed. The army no longer charges into battle with swords and chariots. They arrive with drums, dancers, and psychological warfare. Before striking, they perform interpretive routines meant to destabilize enemy morale. A battalion once defeated an entire Libyan outpost simply by performing a slowed-down Harp remix of I Knew You Were Trouble while staring directly into the enemy commander's soul. The man surrendered without a fight, reportedly muttering, "I didn't know it would hurt this bad. And if a rebellion were to rise? Please." The regime's first line of defense isn't soldiers. It's Swift's cult of historians. These are scribes trained not to fight, but to erase. They travel with blank scrolls and ink made of scorpion venom, and they can unwrite you from history with 3 lines of carefully weaponized verse. Rebels don't just get executed. They get forgotten. Every statue chiseled down. Every record edited. Your mother weeps not because you died, but because she can't remember why she loved you. That's the true fear in Swift's Egypt. Erasure. Not death. Death is kind. But being edited out of the narrative? Unbearable. The city itself reflects this paranoia. There are no alleyways, only wide boulevards watched by obsidian statues with glowing eyes. At every corner, a priestess watches, not to stop crime but to collect stories. Gossip isn't just currency here, it's scripture. The holy texts are not tales of divine triumph but transcripts of conversations. Everything you say might be archived. Everything you do might be interpreted as a symbol. You exist under constant analysis, like a living metaphor walking on 2 anxious legs. In private, citizens perform confession concerts, where they sing their sins to a small audience of friends in exchange for emotional forgiveness. These are usually held in basement chambers lit by candlelight and scented with rose water. If you're especially vulnerable, you might even be gifted a cleansed by ballad sash, which allows you to skip minor public punishments for a week. But if your confession is too rehearsed, too performative, that's another offense. You're then branded a narrative manipulator and sent to the Museum of Oversharing, where you're forced to watch reenactments of your own worst moments performed by teenage interns in bad wigs. Nothing in Swift's Egypt is safe. not even death. Funerals are theatrical. Eulogies are measured in emotional impact. If the deceased wasn't lyrically significant, they're denied entry into the afterlife and buried in the desert of forgettable vibes. Their tombs are left unmarked. Their names are used in cautionary lullabies for children. Don't be like Sadak, he never felt deeply enough. Meanwhile, the graves of those who suffered beautifully are lined in golden ink and adorned with black roses that never wilt, because Taylor said so. This is not a civilization built on logic, fairness, or tradition. It's built on emotional gravity, on making meaning out of heartbreak, on punishing indifference and rewarding performance. It is a kingdom where tears have weight, where poetry is law, and where the most dangerous crime of all is daring to move on before she's done with you. So if you ever find yourself waking up in the sands of ancient Memphis, surrounded by temple walls etched with lyrical anguish, you better start writing. Cry with purpose. Bleed metaphorically. And never, ever forget the first rule of her empire. You are only safe if she hasn't written about you yet. The palace itself was a nightmare of beauty and control. 72 ivory pillars carved with overlapping verses from past betrayals, each one taller than the last, like the heartbreaks were escalating over time, which they were. The floors weren't just polished, they were reflective enough to shame you. You'd see your own face, distorted and small, as you approached the grand dais, reminding you who you were in this world, insignificant unless currently inspiring. Servants weren't permitted to speak above a whisper unless reciting approved lyrics. Even then, tonal accuracy was enforced by the echo guards, a group of eunuchs trained to detect insincerity. Slip into the wrong key while quoting her, and you'd be reassigned to a post where your job was to sort shredded fan letters with a blindfold on. Forever. But the worst part wasn't the guards or the surveillance falcons circling overhead. It was the throne room ceiling. A vast mural of all the men who had ever disappointed her, painted in exquisite detail and arranged in a circular pattern like a divine zodiac of mediocrity. Some were shown crying, others groveling, one or two just mid-shrug, which might have been worse. And in the center, her image, untouched, ascending in a robe of scarlet revenge, holding a scroll and a dagger. Visitors were required to lie flat on their backs before meetings, forced to stare up at the ceiling of shame while pan flutes played slow covers of her deepest cuts. The walls were lined with statues of previous advisors. Not honored, petrified. Each one frozen in a moment of, "I thought I was helping." The records say one of them once suggested she reconsider a line in her speech for clarity. He's now part of the palace architecture, holding up a balcony with his outstretched arms and a look of eternal regret. Birds occasionally nest in his eye sockets. No one moves them. It's considered part of the punishment. Her inner circle consisted of exactly 13 members at all times. No more, no less. 13 always. If someone died, resigned, or dared to fall in love without approval, a replacement was chosen within hours through a process called the culling ballot. Candidates would be summoned from across the empire, dressed in shades of melancholy, and required to perform a one-act tragedy based on a personal emotional failure. Judged not on recovery but on artistic interpretation. The winner earned a ring inscribed with the words, "I'm the problem," and a seat next to the throne, though the throne's armrest was rigged to electrocute any fingers that lingered too long. These advisors weren't there to govern. They were emotional accessories, props for her narrative. They sat in arranged positions according to which era she was embodying. If she was in a fragile phase, the seats were placed farther apart. If she was feeling powerful, they'd be clustered together, facing outward like a defensive ring of poetic suffering. Occasionally she'd switch seats mid-conversation to remind everyone she could change direction at any moment, even in her own story. Especially in her own story. The court astrologer wasn't responsible for predicting the movement of the stars. No one cared about astronomy here. Instead, he charted the emotional tides of the court, mapping who was falling out of favor, whose sighs were too loud, who had paused before agreeing with her. He delivered daily scrolls summarizing the palace's mood, titled things like "Tuesday's energy feels betrayed" or "The vibes are off. Proceed with weeping." Based on these forecasts, the cooks would adjust meal offerings. If the vibe was hopeful, you got honeyed dates and roasted lamb. If melancholy, lentil porridge and a small note that said, "It's okay to feel everything." And the feast. Oh, the feast. No one celebrated like her, mostly because no one dared. Each banquet was themed after a specific heartbreak or public humiliation. One particularly infamous evening was called the Gala of Gaslight, where guests were served dishes that looked delicious but tasted like ash, and the wine refilled itself only when you expressed regret. Entertainment included dancers reenacting arguments she'd once had in private, accompanied by a children's choir that sang, "Maybe You're the Narcissist" in 6-part harmony. At midnight, the room would be flooded with fog, and guests were required to make emotional confessions while wearing masks made of past lovers' jewelry. Romance in the palace was controlled by permits. Any courtship had to be declared, reviewed, and ideally workshopped. Love was not spontaneous. It was curated. If you fell for someone, you were expected to submit a 12-verse poem explaining your intentions, your traumas, and your emotional compatibility score. If the poem passed the Ministry of Alignment scrutiny, a public blessing was scheduled. If it failed, both parties were placed on a 30-day longing fast, which required daily journaling, abstinence from eye contact, and participation in the weekly sob circle, a public gathering where the rejected recited lines like, "I was ready and he wasn't," while being pelted with flower petals by sympathetic grandmothers. The palace had no mirrors, only reflective pools. Standing water scattered through the halls, each pool enchanted with mild illusions to reveal not what you looked like, but how she saw you that day. One day you looked radiant. The next you looked like a disappointment. People avoided them. It was better not to know. Servants weren't born into their roles. They were selected from among the most emotionally complex teenagers of the kingdom. Youths who'd been through things. People who could emote on command. They were trained to listen for tonal shifts in her speech and adjust lighting accordingly. If her voice dropped below a certain pitch, the room dimmed. If it rose, torches flared. Sometimes she'd change tone mid-sentence to test their reflexes. If they failed, they were demoted to ink grinders, spending years locked in chambers turning dried roses into pigment for her scrolls. And it wasn't just the living who had roles in the palace. Statues of long-dead rivals were kept around as cautionary tales. They weren't defaced or destroyed, she liked to preserve their shame. One stood with hands outstretched, holding up a basket labeled, "Unfinished Business." Another was carved with their mouth open, forever mid-apology. They were placed at strategic points in the palace to absorb insults from guests too cowardly to direct them at her. This was encouraged. It gave her plausible deniability. "I don't silence criticism," she once said as her guards escorted a poet out by the neck. "I just redirect it to those who deserve it." There were no clocks in her palace. Time wasn't measured in hours. It was measured in mood swings. The day didn't begin until she said, "Good morning," and if that phrase was delivered with icy politeness, everyone walked on eggshells until further notice. A single hum could delay construction for weeks. A sarcastic, "How lovely," was known to shut down the Navy for a full season. Time here bent to her will, and everyone just prayed to be on the right side of it when it snapped. And snap it did. Frequently. But always with flair. This was no ordinary court. It was a theater. A pulpit. A minefield of affectation, where truth meant nothing unless it rhymed and silence was louder than screams. Where power wore kitten heels and dressed her cruelty in metaphor. Where every step you took was observed, recorded, and potentially turned into a parable about what not to do. And where the only real law was this: you are not the main character here. You never were. You are set dressing in someone else's legacy, and you'd better play your part perfectly. The education system in Taylor Swift's Egypt was a carefully engineered machine of indoctrination wrapped in shimmering linen and scented scrolls. Schools weren't called schools. They were called chambers of becoming. Each one was painted in soft shades of trauma, lined with verses etched into the walls, not maxims about virtue or discipline, but lyrics. Every child learned to read from the papyrus of heartbreak and to write with tears, ink, or both. The alphabet itself had been redesigned to reflect the emotional spectrum, with symbols for regret, hesitation, longing, and revenge. There were no numbers. Math had been abolished after she decided arithmetic was too emotionally cold. Children counted in metaphors. 2 apples plus 2 betrayals equals 1 sad girl pretending she's fine. From the age of 4, children were divided into emotional houses. Not based on social class or ability, but on which of her eras they most embodied. There were the Speak Now kids. Loud, chaotic, full of idealism and poor decision-making. The Red Group. Walking heartbreaks with excellent vocabulary. 1989 kids were precocious performers with control issues. Reputation kids had knives in their lunchboxes and a well-developed sense of betrayal by age 6. The rare child who fit folklore was immediately moved to an isolated mountain school to develop a mysterious backstory. Parents cried with pride. The core subjects were adjusted accordingly. History was taught as a timeline of emotional evolution. Instead of dynastic lines, students memorized breakups and revenge arcs. Geography was taught with emotional cartography. Maps that showed not rivers or mountains but zones of forgiveness, betrayal, and places we don't talk about anymore. Biology was replaced with courses in vibe detection, where students dissected facial expressions and tonal shifts to understand when someone was lying or about to become content. Physical education? A daily interpretive dance class where students reenacted major events from her life using scarves, shadow puppets, and sand drawings. The final exam included crawling through a pit of rose petals while screaming lines from The Archer, then standing perfectly still for 7 minutes while maintaining eye contact with a judge who whispered, "Was it really love?" Half the class failed. They were deemed emotionally undercooked and sent to remedial yearning. And of course, music was mandatory. Not just any music, or music. Harp renditions of Cruel Summer were drilled into the curriculum. Percussion classes involved learning to recreate the beat of her wrath using papyrus drums. Choir practice meant harmonizing with other terrified 10-year-olds as they sang You Belong With Me in minor key for maximum despair. Those who couldn't carry a tune were trained in background humming or sighing, useful skills in court someday. Graduation wasn't determined by academic performance but by emotional climax. A student wasn't considered educated until they'd survived betrayal, written a competent villanelle about it, and sung the final stanza in front of a panel of judges who ranked the performance using tear-counting bowls. A standing ovation was a ticket to the ministry of articulated pain. Silence meant exile to the fields of reflection, a bleak outpost where failed graduates became ghostwriters for state-sponsored ballots. There were no universities. Higher learning was achieved only through public heartbreak. Those who endured a particularly public disgrace, a failed engagement, a disastrous marriage, a scandalous romance with a courtier, were automatically elevated to scholar status. Their writings were studied, their speeches dissected, their pain archived. Libraries in this empire didn't store facts. They stored feelings. You didn't look up knowledge. You sat on velvet cushions and listened to a disillusioned elder recite the time they were ghosted by a man named Amenhotep and what it taught them about trusting too soon. Propaganda wasn't called propaganda. It was curriculum. Every day began with a national reading of the Ballad of the Misunderstood Queen, a semi-fictional retelling of her early years, in which she was born of river water and moonlight, gifted a golden quill by the goddess Isis, and destined to write the world into submission. Children recited it with glassy eyes, unaware that the entire thing had been revised 6 times to improve the pacing. Rebellion was unteachable. In fact, rebellion was reframed as emotional dishonesty. Why would you rebel? The teachers asked. Unless you're hiding something from yourself? Dissenters weren't punished. They were offered counseling. Long, exhausting sessions with priest poets who asked endless questions about their parents, their inner child, their shadow self. Most rebels gave up out of sheer emotional fatigue, eventually agreeing to write a song about their journey and rejoin society as rehabilitated contributors. And then there was the swift scholar track, the elite path. Only the most devastatingly wounded, eloquent, and perceptive students were invited to join. These children were removed from their families at age 11 and placed in glass towers surrounded by mirrors that never reflected the same image twice. They were taught directly by the high reflectors, a cloister of aged lyricists who spoke only in extended metaphors and wore robes made of letters never sent. Students learned how to cry without blinking, how to weaponize disappointment, how to make someone feel guilty just by tilting their head a certain way. By 16 they were fluent in longing. By 17 they could write a diss track so subtle it could destroy a reputation without ever naming the subject. Their final exam involved writing a song so devastating that it caused someone somewhere to break up, even if the couple wasn't in trouble. The highest scoring students were gifted rings made of obsidian and commissioned to ghostwrite the Queen's subtext. The most terrifying part of all this? It worked. This system created a nation of emotionally fluent, metaphor-drenched citizens with no sense of privacy and a deep mistrust of joy. A simple statement like, "I feel fine," could send someone into a 30-minute analysis spiral. Couples broke up over conflicting interpretations of the same lyric. A village once tore itself apart trying to decide if the lakes was hopeful or a funeral. And that's exactly how she liked it. An empire of overthinkers. A country that couldn't move on because moving on was treason. Where healing was allowed, but only if it rhymed. Where memory was sacred, but only when painful. And where education wasn't a path to freedom, but a carefully constructed labyrinth of emotional echoes you never stopped hearing. Because in her Egypt, the smart ones didn't rise. The wounded did. In Taylor Swift's Ancient Egypt, religion didn't just evolve. It was rewritten, remastered, and re-released with bonus prayers. The old gods didn't vanish entirely. They were simply demoted. Ra, the sun god, now served as the lighting director for her sunrise appearances. Anubis, once the feared god of the dead, had been reassigned to spiritual security, tasked with making sure no one snuck into her temple concerts without proper emotional credentials. Batet, formerly the feline protector, was allowed to stay, but only because she resembled one of Taylor's actual cats. That cat, by the way, had her own shrine, her own priesthood, and a monthly column in the temple newsletter called Pause and Reflection. The spiritual heart of her empire was the Grand Temple of Retrospect, a monstrous, glittering structure carved directly into the face of a red mountain overlooking the capital. It could be seen from miles away, especially at dawn, when the rising sun would hit the mirrored panels on the temple's east wing and blind half the city. Pilgrims would crawl on their knees to get there, carrying offerings of old letters, teardrop-shaped beads, and apology notes never sent. No one entered the temple without confessing their most humiliating mistake. This was not optional. Priests with emotional detection wands stood at the gate, ready to turn away anyone who gave off denial energy. Inside, the temple was divided into eras. Literal wings dedicated to different phases of her spiritual mythology. Each section had its own incense blend, its own lighting temperature, and a soundscape curated by ancient audio priests trained in the manipulation of atmosphere through pain. The red wing was all firelight and whispered betrayal. The reputation hall was cold, echoey, and constantly smelled like sandalwood and vengeance. The folklore caverns were hushed and damp, echoing with ghostly harmonies that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. The high priestesses wore cloaks made of fan letters and moved only when necessary. When they spoke, it was always in past tense, as if nothing current was worth mentioning until it became a memory worth rewriting. Their job was not to offer absolution, but to confirm what you already feared, that your greatest sin was thinking you were over it. Worship here wasn't peaceful. It was dramatic, exhausting, and drenched in metaphors. A successful prayer left you drained, raw, and somehow addicted to coming back next week. Worshippers didn't bring animals or grain as sacrifice. They brought secrets. Each confessional chamber required you to kneel and whisper a truth you'd never admitted aloud. The chamber would then analyze the emotional weight of your confession and assign you a song from the sacred canon. You'd be required to meditate on that song for a full moon cycle, preferably through dance, journaling, or synchronized crying with fellow penitents. Those who failed to feel enough were required to start over with a heavier song, usually something from the Speak Now Deluxe edition. Public holidays weren't about victory or harvest. They were emotional anniversaries. National festivals were held on the date of her most legendary heartbreaks. The Day of the Silence, commemorating a rumored week where she didn't write a single lyric, involved 24 hours of no speech, only meaningful glances and hand gestures. The Feast of Reclamation celebrated the moment she took back creative control from a foreign producer, reenacted every year in a dramatic shadow play that ended with the villain being crushed by a falling harp. And then there was the Weep Procession, a mandatory monthly ritual in which all citizens gathered in the central square to mourn a fabricated tragedy. One month it might be the death of an idea. The next, the betrayal of a muse. Participants wore gray linen robes and carried mirrors facing outward, a symbolic gesture meant to reflect pain back at society. As the procession moved, official mourners sobbed on command, trained from childhood to achieve single-tier perfection. Those who couldn't cry were accused of spiritual numbness and required to undergo resensitization therapy in the Ministry of Emotional Tuning. The temple hierarchy was brutal. Acolytes were ranked not by seniority or piety but by emotional range. You could be a novice for decades if you couldn't convincingly perform longing while holding a candle. Priests were trained in lyrical analysis and sacred dramaturgy. Some specialized in breakup theology. Others focused on rage or regret. The most elite among them were licensed in duality doctrine, the sacred balance of victimhood and vengeance. These were the ones who taught advanced courses in justified resentment and inner monologue deconstruction. Religious texts weren't written in prose. They were penned as verses. Each line was required to carry at least one metaphor and one hidden accusation. Those who couldn't speak in layered meanings were considered spiritually basic. The highest form of prayer was the remix, a rewritten version of a sacred hymn, performed live during temple service and judged by a panel of peers on originality and emotional depth. A successful remix could earn you status. A poor one might get you reassigned to temple maintenance, where your job was to polish the shrine to Taylor's silence and reflect on your mediocrity. Miracles were rare but taken very seriously. A river that changed color during a chorus. A cloud formation that resembled a lyric. A baby born crying in perfect melodic intervals. These were not coincidences. They were proof of her divine influence. Every miracle was investigated by the Council of Subtext, who would issue a poetic decree explaining its meaning and instructing the public on how to properly misinterpret it. Death in this religion was not an ending. It was a final performance. Funerals were orchestrated like album releases, teased in advance, heavily aesthetic and always open casket. Mourners were invited to submit their own verses about the deceased, which were judged and ranked on a grief spectrum. Only the top 5 verses were allowed to be spoken aloud. The rest were burned in the pyre and used to heat the ceremonial wine. The dead were buried with headphones, their bodies posed in their most iconic emotional posture. Head tilted, hand near heart, expression unreadable. Of course, blasphemy existed. But not in the form of atheism. The worst offense wasn't disbelief. It was sarcasm. Doubt could be forgiven, but mockery? Mockery meant spiritual exile. The guilty were stripped of their metaphors, shaved of their illusions, and cast into the valley of literalism. A wasteland where no poetry existed, only direct statements. "I'm sad," they'd say over and over until they stopped being anything at all. This was not a religion built on truth. It was built on feeling, on suggestion, on curated trauma. And it worked. People followed not because they believed everything but because they felt everything. Because being confused and overwhelmed and vaguely guilty all the time was better than being ignored. And in the end, isn't that the most sacred thing of all in this Egypt? To never be ignored. To have your heartbreak sanctified, your longing archived, and your worst mistake sung back to you by 1,000 voices in harmony. Because in this holy land, pain wasn't just part of life. It was the only path to the divine. Economics in Taylor Swift's Egypt wasn't built on gold, grain, or livestock. It was powered entirely by emotional transactions. The currency wasn't called a mina, a deben, or a shekel. It was called a token, short for token of regret, and every single one bore the face of a weeping man. Not an allegorical man. A real one. Each coin was struck with the tear-streaked likeness of one of her documented disappointments, immortalized in copper, silver, and for the highest denominations rose gold. To spend money in this empire was to make a statement. This is how much someone's failure is worth. Merchants didn't barter over prices. They argued about intent. A jar of honey might cost 3 tokens if you were buying it for your wife, but 7 if it was for an apology. The market operated like an emotional courtroom. Buyers were required to declare the mood behind their purchases. "I'm buying this linen as a gesture of closure. These pomegranates are for a new beginning. This necklace is performative, but I'm doing my best." Sellers, naturally, had full authority to adjust pricing based on how authentic your answer sounded. If your tone was off, you paid double. Receipts came in the form of breakup notes. No standard format. Just hand-scribbled fragments like, "You said you'd change and then you didn't," or, "I'm not angry, I'm just not interested anymore." Customers were expected to keep these notes in personal shame journals, which were audited monthly by the Ministry of Financial Accountability and Emotional Burden. Jobs weren't assigned based on skill or need. They were matched to your trauma profile. The state kept detailed emotional records on every citizen, and your placement was determined by your unresolved wounds. If you'd been abandoned early in life, you were sent to manage abandonment shelters, a hybrid of post offices and confession booths. If you cheated, you were conscripted into the public works force, digging canals shaped like apology symbols. The more detailed your remorse, the better your chance of promotion. Artisans were revered, but not for technique. Only for heartbreak. To qualify as a royal sculptor, you had to submit evidence of a personal tragedy and a letter from your ex. The deeper the emotional wreckage, the higher your wages. Paintings were sold not based on composition or color theory, but on how many people cried when viewing them. Artists held competitive exhibitions where each piece was presented with no title, and viewers were asked to describe what regret it stirred in them. The winning piece was displayed in the Gallery of Wounds, an elite showroom beneath the palace where the queen herself would occasionally descend to nod in solemn approval before vanishing in a cloud of amber incense. Every industry had been adapted. Architecture wasn't about stability or shelter, it was about symbolism. Houses weren't built to withstand heat or flood, they were constructed to hold space for your pain. Homes came in archetypes: the Tower of Stillness, the Cave of Second Chances, the room you swore you'd never go back to. Interior design was a competitive sport. You didn't decorate for guests. You curated themes. Your kitchen could reflect your fear of intimacy. Your bedroom could be a metaphor for detachment. Landlords didn't ask for rent. They asked for poems, sealed in wax, outlining your personal growth since last season. Even agriculture was emotional. Farmers prayed to the goddess of closure before planting. Crops were rotated based on collective emotional forecasts. A nationwide spike in nostalgia might mean increased wheat cultivation, while mass anxiety triggered an empire-wide switch to figs. It was believed that fruit grown during collective grief tasted sweeter, though scientists were forbidden from proving this, on the grounds that quantifying sorrow would be spiritually violent. The National Bank was not a vault. It was a memory palace. Literally. A sprawling monument with memory chambers where citizens could store emotional investments. Instead of depositing coins, you submitted moments. The birth of your daughter. The day you were ghosted. The exact second you realized you were too forgiving. These were preserved in the archive of Ache, tended by curators who specialized in emotional cataloging. Accessing your account required not a password, but a full-body shiver and a whispered phrase you once swore never to say again. Inflation wasn't a question of scarcity. It was a question of resonance. If a feeling became too common, say heartbreak, it lost market value. Suddenly, crying in public was cheap. You had to go bigger, more dramatic, more poetic. This led to economic bubbles, nationwide surges in guilt, shame, or romantic delusion, each one followed by a cultural correction. When longing peaked one year, the government introduced a campaign called Let's Let Go, encouraging citizens to forgive minor slights. The economy tanked. Artists went on strike. The prime emissary of regret had to resign after being caught resolving a conflict in under 3 scrolls. And so, the Queen decreed that healing would henceforth be taxed. If you let go of a grudge, you owed the state 10% of the emotional value. The richer the grudge, the more you paid. Citizens responded by hoarding resentment. Underground networks popped up, where people met in candlelit rooms to fake sadness over things they'd long since moved past. They performed tears. They recited monologues, all to avoid being charged with premature recovery, a crime punishable by being forced to listen to cheerful music in a locked room for 3 days straight. Tourism was a major industry. Pilgrims came from across the empire to visit the Palace of Regret, the Bridge of Mixed Signals, and the Pyramid of Misunderstood Texts. These landmarks generated massive revenue, not from ticket sales, but from emotional toll booths. Every visitor had to declare a personal failing and assign it a value. That value was converted into tokens and added to the National Archive. The bigger your mistake, the more access you were granted. VIP tourists got to touch her old quills and see the actual sandals she wore during the incident of the year we don't speak of. Merchandise was everywhere. Not standard trinkets, those were banned. The only items legally allowed to be sold were symbolically relevant. A cup shaped like a tear. A candle labeled "I thought you meant it." A hand-woven shawl stitched with the phrase, "Don't flatter yourself, it wasn't about you." But it could have been. Every item came with a certificate of authenticity and a mirror to ensure the buyer could see their reflection while purchasing it. It was important in this economy to understand what you were paying for. You were paying for the chance to matter. And that was the cruel genius of it all. This system wasn't just sustainable, it was addictive. People weren't coerced into labor. They volunteered. Because work made them feel seen. Buying things made them feel important. Being in debt meant you had felt something too deeply. And in this Egypt, that was the highest status you could achieve. To owe everything to a moment. To spend the rest of your life paying off the feeling of once being misunderstood. There were no poor in this empire. Only those who'd never been hurt enough to matter. Military strategy in Taylor Swift's ancient Egypt was not centered on brute force, cavalry strength, or the height of your chariots. No. War here was psychological, theatrical, and devastating in ways that left no visible wounds, but ensured your entire bloodline would live in shame for generations. It wasn't about defeating enemies. It was about emotionally unmaking them. In this empire, swords were backup. The real weapons were words, symbols, and a perfectly timed public spectacle that made surrender feel like the only dignified response. The military, known formally as the Royal Regiment of Emotional Supremacy, wore no armor. Instead, they dressed in mood-appropriate garments tailored to the Queen's current emotional phase. If she was in eras of forgiveness, they wore soft linens dyed in calming shades. If she was in that reputation place again, the uniforms became sharp, shimmering, and edged with small decorative daggers that were never used, but constantly implied. Their most elite division, the Weeping Guard, wore cloaks that trailed behind them like echoes of broken promises. These soldiers didn't fight. They simply arrived on the battlefield, stood silently in formation, and stared until the enemy's morale collapsed under the weight of its own insecurities. Basic training was a 6-month emotional crucible. Recruits were stripped of their names and assigned archetypes based on their unresolved traumas. The hothead, the self-saboteur, the one who apologizes too much. Each archetype came with a corresponding training program designed to break the recruit down and then rebuild them as a weaponized narrative. Physical fitness was tested through symbolic trials. You didn't lift weights, you carried rejection letters up sand dunes. You didn't run laps, you chased metaphors through labyrinths while chanting unresolved arguments from your childhood. The first stage of war was always the scroll drop. These were handcrafted, state-approved open letters written by court poets who specialized in weaponized disappointment. The scrolls were sent to enemy leaders and read aloud in town squares, always beginning with something seemingly soft. This isn't about vengeance, it's about truth, and ending with something that shattered the soul. You could have loved us and you didn't. Entire cities fell without a single spear thrown. If an enemy dared to retaliate with traditional warfare, say by marching soldiers across the border, they would be met by the tactical choir. This was an elite musical battalion trained to perform acoustic renditions of My Tears Ricochet and The Great War while slowly circling the invading army. These performances weren't loud. They were haunting. The choir stood barefoot in the sand, faces covered in veils, harmonizing into the wind until the enemy soldiers either wept, defected, or laid down their weapons and admitted they had a lot of internal stuff to work through. One Canaanite general was so overwhelmed by the performance that he defected mid-battle and later joined the Ministry of Apology drafting. The Empire didn't deploy weapons of mass destruction. It deployed rumors. Spies, called the soft talkers, were trained in the art of casual emotional sabotage. They could infiltrate any camp and within a week, convince an entire unit that their leader was probably projecting something. These spies didn't kill. They instilled doubt. They'd appear with half smiles and whisper things like, "You ever wonder why he never talks about his mother?" and then disappear before anyone could respond. Armies crumbled not from arrows, but from internal group therapy spirals they couldn't escape. Maps were not military blueprints. They were emotional vulnerability charts. Each territory was color-coded by collective insecurity. The eastern borderlands were green, envy, mostly over trade routes and prettier temples. The southern river plains were maroon, heartbreak and abandonment issues. The western desert was just black because the people there had stopped feeling entirely, which made them dangerous. These charts were consulted before every campaign. Generals didn't ask, "Where do we attack?" They asked, "Where does it hurt the most?" Sieges were prolonged emotional affairs. The army would encircle a city, cut off supplies, and then begin a 3-phase assault. Phase 1, projected nostalgia. Massive tapestries of the Queen's greatest betrayals were hoisted on towers, visible for miles. Phase 2, ambiguous messaging. Runners were sent into the city with cryptic notes like, "This could have gone differently," or "We tried, didn't we?" Phase 3, ceremonial silence. For 10 days no sound. Just presence. Just watching. The silence was suffocating. Most cities surrendered by day 4. When it came to naval warfare, ships weren't designed for speed or strength. They were floating stage sets. Swiftian warships featured marble decks, gold thread sails, and figureheads shaped like fallen lovers frozen mid-apology. Crews were trained in synchronized rowing and interpretive semaphore, a visual language of raised flags used not to signal coordinates, but to express complex emotional states. Enemy fleets often hesitated, unsure whether they were being warned or wooed. That hesitation was always fatal. The Queen's military advisors were not generals in the traditional sense. They were former lovers. Men who had disappointed her deeply, repented convincingly, and been reborn as war strategists. Their punishments were public, their confessions recorded, and their loyalty absolute. Each was branded with a lyric and forbidden from ever writing again. When they entered the war room, they carried not maps but diaries. Their job was to remember what it felt like to fail her and apply that feeling to the subjugation of entire regions. But the most feared weapon in her arsenal? The exile spell. A metaphysical punishment so severe it was only invoked once every decade. When cast, it erased your name from every song, every scroll, every statue. It was as if you never mattered, never existed, never caused the ache that had inspired 1,000 verses. No one spoke of the exiled. They became emotional phantoms, present in feeling, absent in form. Whole towns built on their memory became ruins overnight. Lovers forgot anniversaries. Parents forgot their children. Memory, the last sacred currency, was gone. And still the Queen didn't gloat. She simply wrote. She wrote about the silence after war. About empty cities that still echoed with almosts and maybes. About fields of discarded banners that smelled like sweat and guilt. Her lyrics became war memorials. Her metaphors became law. And her enemies, when they weren't dead or haunted, became fans. Quiet, reluctant fans. The kind who bought tokens under aliases and cried when no one was watching. In her Egypt, war wasn't hell. It was therapy, unwanted, uninvited, and deeply personal. And by the end of it, you were either healed or erased. Nothing in between. Diplomacy under Taylor Swift's reign was an art form so tangled, so layered, and so deeply unhinged that no foreign ambassador left her court with both dignity and clarity intact. Foreign affairs in ancient Egypt, once the realm of formal treaties, royal intermarriage, and heavily bribed peace offerings, had transformed into an ongoing, emotionally charged performance piece called, "We're Fine Really." Nobody believed it. Everybody kept showing up anyway. Ambassadors were no longer chosen for their tact or knowledge of politics. Instead, they were chosen based on emotional intelligence, poetic literacy, and whether or not they could read a facial twitch from 20 paces. Before being accepted at court, they underwent a strict vetting process that included a dramatic reading of The Moment I Knew, a 15-minute eye contact endurance trial with a mid-level priestess, and a public apology for something they didn't do. If they hesitated, they were sent back to their kingdom marked as unprepared to deal with complex women. Her throne room had no negotiation table. That was too transactional. Instead, visiting diplomats were seated on slightly too low cushions beneath her gilded platform, symbolically reinforcing that they were not equals, not ever. Conversations were held in the style of emotionally nuanced monologues, long, carefully constructed sentences filled with double meanings, lingering pauses, and the occasional vulnerable confession that may or may not have been a trap. She didn't shake hands. She tilted her head slowly as if to say, "I'm listening, but you're already disappointing me." There were no treaties. There were understandings, vague poetic agreements scrawled on rosewater-stained papyrus and sealed with wax pressed from the queen's personal ring. The seal didn't show her name or crest. It showed a mirror. Symbolism mattered. Every agreement included an addendum requiring both parties to reflect regularly on intention, tone, and follow-through, which conveniently allowed her to declare violations whenever she felt personally let down. Sometimes the foreign rulers were so unsure of what they'd agreed to that they sent follow-up envoys just to confirm. These envoys were greeted by the Council of Misdirection, 12 men and women trained to answer every question with a question. Did we breach the accord? Did you feel like you did? Are you worried about that? Should we be? Conversations spiraled. Empires unraveled. In one infamous case, a Phoenician prince returned home after 6 weeks in the capital unable to speak in declarative sentences ever again. His people assumed he had been cursed. In a way he had. Gift-giving in diplomatic circles had become a psychological minefield. The queen hated obvious flattery. Gold? Try harder. Jewelry? That better come with an apology letter and backstory. Rare spices? What are you implying? That her cooking lacks flavor. One Babylonian emissary, in an attempt to impress her, presented a ceremonial dagger said to be forged from the bones of a traitor. She accepted it with a smile, then sent it back the next day with a small note that read, "You're projecting." Babylon didn't speak to Egypt for 6 years. But the most dangerous mistake a foreign dignitary could make was trying to seduce her. Many tried. All failed. Some thought they could charm her with declarations of beauty and power. Others tried mystery, stoicism, or just being themselves. Every attempt was logged, categorized, and eventually turned into an epic poem, circulated throughout the empire, titled things like "The King Who Tried Too Hard" or "Your Empire's Not That Big, Calm Down." The worst offenders were immortalized as marble statues positioned outside the Hall of Disappointments, forever sculpted mid-pickup line, their hands outstretched, their mouths frozen in misguided compliments. Of course, no one could prove the queen encouraged any of this. She never said anything directly cruel. She just smiled and let the world unravel on its own. When one particularly bold Grecian envoy asked, "What do you actually want from us?" she simply replied, "I want what I already have." It wasn't until he returned home and saw his kingdom's trade routes quietly rerouted through Hittite ports that he realized what she meant. Political alliances weren't formal. They were emotional. If she liked a ruler, she wrote about them, an ode, a verse, a public metaphor that painted them as the one who finally understood. It didn't matter if it was true. That ruler's status skyrocketed across the known world. Trade deals flowed. Borders relaxed. Their name became a symbol of emotional competence. But when the queen stopped writing about you, you were done. Kingdoms collapsed trying to win back her metaphorical attention. A well-timed compliment in the press could earn you a minor economic boom. A poorly timed silence could tank your cotton industry. The queen's preferred method of conflict resolution was the allegorical trial. Whenever another kingdom angered her, whether through insult, oversight, or just general bad vibes, she'd convene her court and put on a play. Not a traditional play. A searingly dramatic piece of interpretive performance that featured exaggerated versions of the offending party's behavior, rewritten in emotional symbols. No names were used, but everyone understood who it was about. The play always ended the same way, with the main character walking alone into the desert, muttering, "I guess it's just me then." No one dared retaliate. Not out of fear of military reprisal, but because no one wanted to be turned into content again. Meanwhile, her spies, the mirrors in shadow, collected intel not for leverage but for lyric inspiration. They didn't steal secrets. They observed feelings. They infiltrated enemy courts posing as courtesans, servants, lost poets. They kept diaries. They mailed emotional summaries back to the palace every week. The Assyrian crown prince seems uncertain of his worth. The Elamite queen is overcompensating. These reports were never used for blackmail. They were used for material. Because in this world, international relations weren't about advantage. They were about emotional clarity. And once the queen had your emotional blueprint, she didn't need your armies or your gold. She could end you with a line. There were rumors, of course, that some rulers tried to ignore her. To treat her like any other pharaoh. These rulers no longer existed. Their kingdoms? Buried in the sands. Their names? Struck from records, their faces scratched from stone. Not by war. By erasure. By public indifference. By becoming a cautionary tale, the king who thought this was just politics. And so, the world learned. Not to love her. Not even to respect her. But to fear her attention, and worse, her silence. Because in Taylor Swift's Egypt, your greatest diplomatic nightmare wasn't that she'd declare war on you. It was that she wouldn't write about you at all. In Taylor Swift's Egypt, the afterlife wasn't a mystery. It was a production. Not in the spiritual sense, but in the theatrical, high-budget, emotionally manipulative kind that made death not just inevitable, but a performance you were expected to prepare for. The ancient Egyptians believed in the field of reeds. Taylor believed in legacy. And if your life didn't end with an arc, a moral, and a devastating third-act twist, you weren't getting past the underworld gate. Your soul would be turned back with a passive-aggressive note that read, "Unresolved. Try again." Burial rituals had changed. Mummification was no longer a sacred preservation of the body. It was a full glam session. Corpses were embalmed with lavender oils, wrapped in linens dyed with poetic regrets, and adorned with eyeliner so sharp that priests had to take training courses in wing symmetry. The goal wasn't to preserve the body, it was to frame it. To make sure that even in death you looked like someone who had felt things deeply. The Book of the Dead? Rewritten. Now called the Era Scrolls. Each chapter chronicled not your good deeds or piety, but your emotional arc. It began with your first heartbreak, moved through your betrayal period, and concluded with your redemption ballad. If your scroll lacked cohesion, your soul got sent to editorial purgatory, where low-ranking priestesses tried to help you rewrite your narrative until it was worthy of eternal playback. There was no final judgment by Anubis weighing your heart. Instead, there was the ceremony of aesthetic closure. Picture this. A stage beneath a star-strewn canopy, where your loved ones and enemies alike gathered to watch a dramatized reenactment of your entire emotional life. Actors played younger versions of you. There was lighting, music, a slow-motion montage of your most questionable decisions, overlaid with a harp cover of You're Losing Me. The audience was required to submit anonymous notes afterward ranking your vulnerability, self-awareness, and whether or not your ending felt earned. Hearts weren't weighed against feathers anymore. They were weighed against context. Sure, she was selfish, the priest judge might say, stroking his gold-tipped chin. But did we consider her abandonment issues? Let's workshop this. Entire souls were kept in metaphysical limbo for centuries while spiritual dramaturgs debated whether their villain era had been properly resolved. A soul who failed to show personal growth was tossed into the pit of redundancy, where it was doomed to relive the same three emotional mistakes forever, often while being narrated by disapproving exes. Cemeteries had been replaced with reflection gardens, vast fields of obsidian slabs, each engraved with a single line that summarized the person buried beneath. But not something dull like beloved father or faithful wife. No. These epitaphs were painfully honest, often crowdsourced from anonymous court surveys. She never apologized but always cried louder. He peaked emotionally at 26. We loved her. She scared us. Mourners didn't bring flowers. They brought ink and blank scrolls to write letters they never got to send. These letters were burned in midnight ceremonies and released into the air as ash confetti while the crowd whispered a single word: closure. Some tried to cheat the system. A nobleman once paid a high priest to forge a more flattering emotional arc for his era scroll. It was discovered during his ceremony when his soul attempted to cry at a key moment and failed to produce tears. The audience gasped. His ex-wife stood up and shouted, "That's not what happened." He was immediately struck from the records and sentenced to the forgotten sand, a dry, joyless wasteland where emotionally dishonest souls were forced to rewatch the real versions of their lives until they finally stopped interrupting with, "But that's not fair." Reincarnation wasn't based on karma. It was based on resonance. If your emotional frequency aligned with a historical figure, you were reborn into a similar life so you could get it right this time. Someone who spent their first life bottling up rage might come back as a loud, unapologetic dancer with a sword. Someone who died a martyr to politeness might return as a court jester armed with biting sarcasm. Souls were allowed a maximum of 13 lives, one for each of the Queen's albums. On the 13th, you either transcended into the chorus eternal or became dust in the wind, humming the wrong bridge forever. And the Queen herself? She didn't die. That was the official belief. Death for Taylor was rebranded. She had simply entered the bonus track. Shrines to her final known residence were erected in every major city, temples built not from stone, but from unsent letters, concert wristbands, and the bones of men who said she wasn't that deep. Worshippers left offerings of old diary entries and whispered lines like, "I see it now, the worst is over," hoping to be granted emotional clarity by morning. Religious holidays became anniversaries of her rumored deaths, each one marked with fasting, emotional audits, and communal cry-ins. On the day of the vanishing, people painted their faces with glitter and wore robes stitched with their regrets. They walked slowly through the streets in silence, stopping at random intervals to yell, "I still care, I just wish I didn't," into the sky. It was considered both a release and an act of national loyalty. Afterlife tourism boomed. The reflection gardens alone attracted tens of thousands each season. Guided tours included dramatic readings of famous epitaphs and interactive workshops where tourists could draft their own final verses, just in case. One popular activity was the Regret Reenactment Booth, where actors helped you relive your worst decisions and offered better ways you could have handled them, complete with costume changes and alternate endings. Most visitors cried. The rest left inspired to mess up again, but more beautifully. Even the underworld got a rebrand. Once feared, now curated. Do It, the shadowy realm of the dead, became the Vault, a vast metaphysical archive where all unwritten verses, suppressed feelings, and abandoned narratives were stored. Only the most emotionally articulate souls were allowed access. It was said that wandering the vault could bring either madness or transcendence, depending on your capacity to face your own metaphors. Many entered. Few came out unchanged. One man reportedly wandered into a corridor of unresolved lyrics and emerged 17 years later with a lute and a completely different accent. His wife had remarried. He left them both a verse and walked into the sea. There was no heaven. Only catharsis. And even that wasn't guaranteed. In Taylor Swift's Egypt, immortality didn't come from virtue. It came from narrative impact. People kept quoting you, you lived. If they stopped, you faded. The gods were replaced by ghosts with good stories. The monuments were built not for kings, but for those who said what they meant and meant it gorgeously. And in the end, everyone understood the truth. You could be flawed, cruel, a little much. But if you were unforgettable, you'd live forever. Not in paradise. Not in peace. But in the lyric, where it always hurt, and always would. Marriage in Taylor Swift's Egypt was not a romantic milestone. It was a public contract drenched in symbolism, inspected by state officials, annotated by poets, and legally bound by emotional performance. You didn't just marry someone. You entered a narrative arc co-authored by the state, and your failure to deliver a satisfying character development could result in public shaming, annulment, or mandatory inclusion in the next National Tragedy Festival. Love here wasn't blind, it was mic'd, lit, and workshopped in front of a focus group. The marriage process began with the Emotional Compatibility Tribunal. Couples didn't propose. They submitted petitions. These petitions included detailed trauma timelines, expressive writing samples, and performance clips from previous relationships. Judges, usually former palace lyricists or scandalized divorcees turned spiritual consultants, Analyzed your history of heartbreak for consistency, tone, and emotional growth. If your heartbreaks looked too similar, you were flagged for stagnation. If you hadn't had enough, you were considered unripe. There was an entire category of citizens labeled plotless, and they weren't permitted to marry at all. If your petition passed, you were scheduled for a previewing. This was a semi-public ceremony where you and your partner stood on an amphitheater stage and performed your emotional dynamic for a live audience. You reenacted a fight, shared a vulnerable secret, delivered personal monologues. There was music, costume changes. At the end, the audience held up mirrors, symbolic approval tokens. If too many reflections were turned downward, the match was declared emotionally confusing and immediately cancelled. The audience was trained in emotional resonance scoring. No one was unqualified. Everyone was accountable. Wedding ceremonies themselves were Baroque exercises in storytelling. There was no priest, only a master of tone. The couple walked a path lined with symbols, wilted roses for past pain, cracked jars for misunderstandings, and a pool of water in which they were required to see their reflections before continuing. Vows weren't promises. They were predictions. You stood before the crowd and declared, "This is how I will disappoint you," followed by your partner's prepared forgiveness. The audience wept, then cheered, then passed around velvet boxes containing tissues, dried tears, and tiny slips of paper with quotes like, "It's okay to hurt if it's sincere." Marriage wasn't until death. That was too final. It was until narrative completion. If the arc resolved early, if you both grew faster than expected, or if one partner became emotionally irrelevant, you could apply for a mutual transition, a state-sponsored exit ceremony involving a dual confession, a shared musical performance, and a parting gift selected by the Council of Closure. These gifts were symbolic. One ex-couple received a single sandal. Another got a burned scroll containing their first misunderstanding, rewritten in a neutral tone. The goal wasn't to sever. It was to release. Beautifully. Publicly. With applause. Cheating wasn't illegal. It was considered genre experimentation. But it had to be declared. If a partner strayed without informing the Bureau of Narrative Twists, the affair was classified as unauthorized plot divergence and punishable by forced enrollment in the Ministry of Poetic Justice. Offenders were publicly read to, dramatic, line-by-line analyses of their worst moments, delivered by emotionally disappointed schoolchildren in candlelight. These readings were not optional. You attended. You wept. You took notes. There were no mistresses. Only supporting characters. Every marriage license included a clause about secondary arcs. If your partner met someone who added depth to their emotional journey, you were expected to tolerate that presence, provided it didn't overshadow the primary narrative. When jealousy arose, the state sent a mediator, a tall woman in velvet with a clipboard and no patience. She would sit all three of you down and say, "Who's the main character here?" If no one could answer, the marriage was put on pause until further clarification. Anniversaries were massive productions, not private dinners. Reenactments. You revisited key emotional moments, both good and bad, with choreographed movement, live musical accompaniment, and optional audience participation. If the marriage had struggled that year, you performed a duet titled "We're Still Here," somehow. If it had flourished, you performed "Maybe Love Is Enough" this time. Either way, the Queen's name was mentioned. Always. To her who showed us how to hurt correctly. Guests toasted with lavender wine. Children sat in circles and drew pictures of emotional honesty. Divorce wasn't shameful. It was sacred. A national ritual called the Beautiful Undoing. You wrote letters. Burned items. Rewound memories. The separation ceremony included a slow dance to a song neither of you liked, symbolizing the discomfort of release. Then, with your fingers laced together one final time, you told the story of your first meeting in two different versions. The audience voted on which version felt truer. That version was entered into public record. The other was sent to the Vault of Almosts, a sacred archive of half-truths no one dared reread. Children born within a marriage were not automatically registered. Parents had to submit an essay titled "Why We Think This Was a Good Idea," followed by a symbolic handoff at the Hall of Intentions. If the essay lacked depth, the child was not removed, just heavily supervised by the Ministry of Foreshadowing. At age 5, the child was evaluated for narrative promise. Those deemed too good for this world were trained for artistic roles. Those deemed plot devices were sent to therapy. Widowhood came with a script. A 12-part grieving protocol, drafted by royal decree, that included weekly monologues, monthly dream recitations, and annual tributes to what could have been. Widows weren't expected to move on. They were expected to ascend, to become icons of unfinished love. A widow who grieved poorly, too little, too soon, too awkwardly, was quietly reassigned as a background character in someone else's story. To lose your love was tragic. To lose your aesthetic? Unforgivable. And through it all the queen watched. Not physically, she rarely attended weddings unless she predicted a divorce worthy of song. But her influence saturated every ritual. Her verses lined every chapel wall. Her heartbreaks echoed in every promise. And in the back of every citizen's mind was the quiet, terrifying truth. Your relationship wasn't just between you and your partner. It was also with the audience, with the narrative, with her. Because in Taylor Swift's Egypt, marriage wasn't about love. It was about being worth writing about. Fashion in Taylor Swift's Egypt wasn't about utility, status, or even vanity. It was about storytelling. What you wore announced your emotional state, your current narrative arc, and your relationship to the queen's ongoing mythos. It was not clothing, it was character design. And getting it wrong wasn't a fashion faux pas. It was an identity crisis punishable by exile to the sand wardrobe, a desolate region where the banished wandered in beige, draped in neutral linen until they found a reason to feel something again. Outfits weren't purchased, they were prescribed. The Ministry of Styling and Symbolism, MOS, issued monthly wardrobe mandates based on the nation's collective emotional tone. If the queen was in her midnight's mood, the entire capital shifted to silk robes and bruised lilac and storm cloud blue. If she was channeling lover, markets exploded in pastel floods, and accessories grew hearts and glittered like apologies. Merchants didn't advertise based on trends. They issued public statements. This month we are all pretending we're over it. Here is a cloak with closure in the hem. Clothes had names. Not types, names. You didn't wear a tunic. You wore I forgave you too quickly or the one that didn't text back. A particular shade of crimson was known across the empire as he's not crying but he should be. To wear white was not a statement of purity but of self-denial, and to mix patterns, especially if they clashed in theme, was considered narrative incoherence, which could lead to a public citation for aesthetic inconsistency. Tailors weren't mere craftsmen. They were licensed emotion translators, trained in the queen's garment houses from the age of 8. These children learned to sew while reciting lyrics and were required to cry into their thread at least once a week to keep it charged. The best tailors had waitlists that spanned years. To be measured by one was a rite of passage. To be misunderstood by one was a scandal. One courtier reportedly wept after being fitted in a robe called letting go is not weakness, claiming she had clearly been more in a holding the grudge gracefully phase. The tailor was fired, exiled, and later became a minor cult figure among the emotionally stubborn. Jewelry functioned like punctuation. A simple gold band didn't symbolize wealth. It was a visual ellipsis, something unsaid, lingering. An asymmetrical earring meant inner conflict. 2 anklets, never one, signaled you were in denial. Bangles were stacked based on the number of regrets you were currently processing. The clang of them in palace halls sounded like music, but everyone knew it was just someone struggling to get past chapter 3 of their personal saga. Hair wasn't styled, it was scored. Women arranged their braids into shapes that mirrored emotional motifs. Spiral grief, forked betrayal, cascading confusion. Men were expected to do less but feel more. A shaved head was not a bold choice but a silent cry for narrative redirection. Headscarves were embroidered with quotes from public apologies. Wigs, common and elaborate, were coated with emotional timelines. The longer the wig, the longer the healing. The higher the poof, the higher the stakes. The queen's personal hair was rumored to be woven with actual thread from her diary pages, which explained why no one ever touched it and why her stylist walked backward when exiting the room. Shoes were confessionals. Every sandal sole was engraved with a personal truth. The idea was that every step you took left behind a message, pressed lightly into the dust. Lovers read each other's footprints in the mornings. Families swept the streets daily not to clean them but to erase secrets. Special occasions required fresh soles, often dipped in ink for contrast. At her coronation anniversary, the queen wore sandals that spelled he should have known better from heel to toe, and for a week afterward, the entire empire refused to reply to messages that lacked emotional accountability. Fashion shows were sacred rituals. Held monthly in the Temple of Reinvention, these events showcased new garments themed around a single feeling. Past shows included the morning of almost triumphant loneliness and sorry isn't sexy. Models weren't chosen for beauty but for how much internal conflict they could project while walking. Judges sat in silence, ranking pieces not by cut or quality, but by how hard they hit emotionally. One robe inspired such collective despair that the audience collapsed in synchronized grief, triggering an emergency national day of emotional hydration. The Queen's own wardrobe? Mythical. Her outfits were unveiled like holy texts. When she emerged in public, people didn't gasp because she looked good. They gasped because they suddenly understood something they hadn't before. Her green velvet cloak from year 10 wasn't just a fabric choice. It was the unofficial end of forgiveness. Her gold-stitched morning gown during the Great Withdrawal signaled the temporary ban on lightheartedness across the empire. Her translucent silver cape during the eclipse of truth was so emotionally overwhelming that 3 ambassadors fainted and one priest declared, "I am seen. I am not ready." Criticism of the Queen's fashion was rare. Not illegal, just deeply unwise. One sculptor once said her collarbones were too symbolic, and his name was quietly removed from every public record. He wasn't executed. He wasn't exiled. He just wasn't mentioned anymore. That's what scared people the most. Not punishment, but being left out of the narrative. In this kingdom, anonymity was the only true death. Textiles held memory. Certain fabrics were believed to absorb the emotions of their wearers and could only be burned at specific phases of the moon. Some families passed down grief tunics, heirlooms worn only during personal tragedies, embroidered with generation upon generation of, "I didn't think it would end like this." These garments weren't washed. Ever. To do so would erase the ache. They were kept in cedar-lined chests beside letters never sent and photos where no one's looking at the camera. And underneath it all, lingerie was political. Lace symbolized unresolved tension. Cotton meant you'd given up. Silk was forbidden unless you'd forgiven someone without being asked. There were underground markets that sold illegal satin to people who couldn't let go of past humiliations. These markets were raided monthly not to shut them down, but to collect new lyrics. Because in Taylor Swift's Egypt, what you wore told the world not who you were, but what your narrative demanded. Clothing wasn't a shield or a luxury. It was prophecy worn on the skin. And everyone knew, if you dressed wrong for your story, the story would rewrite itself to fit the outfit. And you might not survive the next scene. Justice in Taylor Swift's Egypt was not blind. It wore mascara that didn't smudge, kept detailed receipts, and held a microphone instead of a gavel. Courtrooms weren't places for truth, they were stages for emotional reckoning. Trials were public spectacles choreographed with the precision of a stadium tour. The goal wasn't legal resolution. It was narrative satisfaction. The difference? One seeks peace. The other demands closure. Laws weren't written in dry, ambiguous legalese. They were sung. Literally. The Code of Accountability was a 43-verse anthem performed quarterly by the Ministry of Consequence, complete with key changes, interpretive dance, and mood lighting. Every citizen was expected to memorize it by age 12. Ignorance of the lyrics was not a defense. If you couldn't quote the bridge to Rule 17, "Don't promise what you can't articulate," you were automatically deemed emotionally negligent and forced to attend a week-long seminar called Saying What You Mean Without Saying Too Much. Court was held in the Hall of Mirrors, a cavernous chamber made entirely of polished obsidian and water pools. Defendants stood barefoot on a raised platform known as the reflecting stage, surrounded by a silent audience of judges, victims, and state-assigned narrators. These narrators didn't interpret the law. They interpreted you. They summarized your intentions, your tone, your micro-expressions. If you blinked too fast during a statement, they paused the proceeding. Note the blink. That wasn't fear. That was guilt wearing uncertainty. Every case began the same way, with a public reading of the opening scroll, a formal document outlining not just the crime, but the emotional stakes. Today we consider the case of one who withheld affection, delayed replies, and mislabeled his emotional availability. Gasp, whispers, sometimes applause. The scroll was then handed to the emotional forensics team, who unpacked it line by line, referencing witness statements, diary entries, dream transcripts, and, if necessary, song recommendations from the Queen's archives. The accused was not expected to plead guilty or not guilty. They had to perform their accountability statement. This was a live 3-minute piece of spoken word, backed by a slow drumbeat, in which the defendant explained what they did, why they did it, and what it cost them to admit it. A poor performance, too defensive, too rehearsed, not enough trembling in the voice, meant immediate elevation to high trial. A good performance bought you sympathy. Maybe even redemption. If you cried and it looked real, the audience leaned in. If you didn't, the choir of inner voices hummed disapproval in minor key. Victims were given equal platform, but more time. They could use props, metaphors, even actors to portray their side of the story. One famously betrayed wife built a sand sculpture of her husband's emotional distance during her testimony. Another man, abandoned during illness, played a harp until it broke. The court wept. The judges clapped. The defendant vomited from stress. There were no traditional punishments. No jails. No chains. There were arcs. If found guilty, you were not condemned. You were sentenced to development. This could take the form of a redemption residency, 30 days in a public glass house where you lived with your mistakes. Spectators passed by, leaving post-it notes on the walls. You didn't listen when it mattered. She wasn't being dramatic. You just weren't paying attention. The goal was not to humiliate, but to marinate. To soak in your failure until it reshaped your narrative. If you emerged and delivered a convincing Reformation monologue, you were released. If not, you went back in. Some were sentenced to the echo fields, vast plains where offenders wandered while speakers replayed their most emotionally dishonest statements on a loop. I just don't want anything serious right now. You're too sensitive. I never said we were exclusive. The fields were dotted with shrines built by exes. If you wept at the right one, you were allowed to leave. If you rolled your eyes, the storm began. Others were given roles in the National Apology Theater. This was a state-run troupe composed entirely of offenders, performing rotating productions of what you should have said. Each actor played themselves, reenacting their lowest moment, but better. More honest. More accountable. Some shows ran for months. One man, a chronic ghoster, performed the vanishing act 7 nights a week until he finally looked his scene partner in the eye and said, "I was scared you'd see me." Standing ovation. Release granted. There were, of course, crimes so severe that traditional arc resolution wasn't enough. These were the narrative breakers. People whose betrayals were so profound, so narratively unsatisfying, that no apology could fix them. These individuals were not executed. They were redacted. Removed from all records. Their faces blurred in family murals. Their names replaced with symbols of disappointment. The Queen did not speak of them. She didn't need to. Their absence echoed louder than any punishment. Still, some tried to dodge accountability. They hired emotional spin artists to reframe their actions. He didn't manipulate. He was misunderstood by time. These tactics sometimes worked, until the Queen released a new ballad. One verse, one chorus, and the entire court reeled in clarity. Public perception flipped. The once innocent looked suddenly monstrous. A citizen once sued the crown over this. Claimed defamation. Lost. The ruling stated, "Art is above reproach when it tells the truth too loudly for your comfort." Appeals were allowed, but only if you could prove character growth. You had to present a scrapbook of your redemption. Conversations you used to avoid, letters you never sent but wrote anyway, dreams where you finally told the truth. These were reviewed by a council of elders known as the formerly unbearable, retired offenders who'd earned peace through relentless self-awareness. If they cried reading your scrapbook, you were free. If they stayed dry-eyed, you were told to keep digging. Civil disputes weren't settled with evidence. They were settled with poetry battles. Two parties stood opposite each other, surrounded by loved ones, and exchanged stanzas until someone flinched. The flinch didn't have to be visible. Could be a breath. Pause. A swallowed maybe. When it happened, the battle was over. The crowd cheered. Justice had been felt. And always above it all, the Queen's shadow loomed, not as judge but as standard. The law didn't ask, "Is this fair?" It asked, "Is this compelling?" Because in her empire, justice was never about balance. It was about resonance, repercussion, remorse performed with perfect pacing. And most importantly, it was about making sure the ending landed. Some empires are remembered for their armies. Others for their monuments. But this one? This one was built on memory, myth, and meticulously documented emotional devastation. It didn't need a legacy. It was the legacy. Every heartbreak became law. Every silence was curated. And every citizen knew, the worst thing you could be was forgettable. Because in this Egypt, ruled by one eyeliner-wearing oracle with a dagger for a pen, the story was the throne. And if you weren't part of the narrative, you were already gone. Now, if you want more brutal bedtime stories wrapped in sarcasm, sand, and psychological warfare, subscribe. Before history rewrites you out too.